All right, so today, I mentioned before, or a couple weeks ago, that as we look at these sacrifices, we have to also talk about sin. And so today's lesson is, I won't say it's, I hope it's not discouraging, but I hope it's clarifying some of the things that are going on in the Old Testament. So, see if this works here. All right, so why sacrifices? Let's say something else wrong.
Just lighting.
Oh, the lighting. Oh, do I have an aura on the camera? I must have like a halo or something. We need to get rid of that in a hurry. So we're looking at Leviticus 1 through 16, and primarily because I wanted to look at the Day of Atonement in Israel. And the Day of Atonement in Israel has a lot of, the New Testament uses this constantly. Jesus himself uses this. John the Baptist used this. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And the parallels, the spiritual parallels that are drawn, that the people of Israel should have drawn for themselves, but are made clear for us in the New Testament. There's much for us to learn there. But to understand Leviticus 16, Leviticus 1 through 15 is there to help us understand what's going on in Leviticus 16. So we kind of want to walk through or tiptoe through Leviticus 1 through 15 so we can understand a little bit better. No, Tiny Tim. All right, so the book of Leviticus, just by way of review, much of it is written between the books of Exodus and Numbers. And Exodus concludes with the making of the covenant between God and his people, and then the building of the tabernacle. Then Leviticus comes after that, and then Numbers begins the wilderness wanderings after the covenant is made. So the question that the law from Exodus 20 through the end of Deuteronomy, the question that the law is trying to answer is, how does a holy God live with a sinful people? So God made a covenant with Israel. God is a holy God who cannot look at sin, and Israel are people who are sinful. And so how can this covenant work? That's the question that it's really, I think, trying to answer. So our outline of study, we're talking about sacrifices, Leviticus 1 through 7, and I put in there sin because the next set of sacrifices is on sin offerings. Well, if you're offering for sin, we have to understand what sin was in the Old Testament. What are the different kinds of sin? And we're going to look at one today, just one of the types of sins today. Then there's a section on the priests, Leviticus 8 through 10, uncleanness chapters, Leviticus 11 through 15, and then Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16. So that's our goal, Leviticus 16. So today we're going to talk about one kind of sin. Next week we'll cover the other two, Lord willing. Obviously, I just mentioned there's three. Okay. But one of them is not mentioned in Leviticus. And then we talked a little bit about the case law and interpretation in the Old Testament. So often what you get is a title of the law, but that's usually a long phrase or sentence. There might be some introduction. There's usually a couple cases, if this situation, maybe some exceptions or additions, and then kind of a conclusion. And we saw that in the first three chapters that was followed pretty clearly. We'll see that again in chapters 4 through 6. And it's important for keeping each one separate from the other so we don't get confused on those. And then we talked about the tabernacle because the tabernacle is referenced. Now, Joanne's already asked another question. Is the tabernacle, how does the tabernacle sit within the people of Israel? So I'll add a slide for next week that kind of gives that picture, because you've got a lot of traffic coming to and from the tabernacle. How does just logistically, how does that work? not only people bringing sacrifices, but also priests bringing things to be burnt outside the camp, and back and forth and stuff like that. So there's a lot of activity. But the altar, the gate faces east. Well, it's supposed to face east. Oh, it is. Well, on that slide it is, I guess. But the gate faced east, and right inside you had the altar. So when you were bringing a sacrifice, you brought it to the gate. In most cases, you had your hand on the animal. In most cases, you would kill the animal yourself, which was slitting the throat of the animal. And then the priests would take it from there. And they would cut it up and parse it as needed according to the law. You would tell the priest what you were bringing it for. And then they would follow the prescriptions of how to burn it on the altar and all of those kinds of things. And so far, the first three that we've seen in Leviticus 1 through 3, those sacrifices didn't make it past the brazen altar. We only got that far in the tabernacle. So that's just for our reference as we read through it. Okay, so in chapter 1 we had burnt offerings, and in chapter 2 we had grain offerings, which was bread, and in chapter 3 we had peace offerings. We're going to review those a little bit. We're going to see those. One of the passages we're going to look at is in Numbers 15. We're also going to look at Numbers 35, but I think it's in Numbers 15. We'll see the grain offering and the peace offering again. We're going to get a little bit more information on those today. Okay, so sin offerings for sin, is in Leviticus 4 through 7. We're not going to actually look at Leviticus 4 through 7 today, because as I mentioned, if these are sacrifices for sin, well, then we have to know what the sin is. And there's some wording that's there's some bad translation, unfortunate translation, I'll put it that way, in our English versions. But chapter 4, for example, starts out with, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins," and then in the ESV it has unintentionally. We'll talk about that next week. "If anyone sins in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, then," okay, so that's the title. This is offerings for sin. The word for sin in Hebrew and the word for sin offering in Hebrew are the same word. So if you've sinned, you bring a sin to the tabernacle. Well, everyone knows that you're bringing an offering because of what's described here. So the word offering is actually implied. So it's a sin for a sin is what's going on here. And the animal, the offering, is taking the sin away from the person making the offering. So you can already see perhaps how we see this in Christ for us. Okay, so what I would like to do is briefly mention this. There are three types of sin in the Old Testament. We're going to look at high-handed sin today. The reason it's called high-handed sin is the Bible calls it a high-handed sin. That's why. There's intentional sin, and then there is unknowing sin. And I'm using the word unknowing instead of a sin of ignorance, because sin of ignorance, an unknowing sin, there's two different ways in which the sin is unknown in Leviticus. When we think of a sin of ignorance, we only think of one of those. That is, I didn't know that what I did was wrong. I didn't know what the speed limit was. Police officer, that sin of ignorance. I didn't know I was supposed to report that on my tax form. That kind of thing. There's two different kinds in the Old Testament. So if we call it a sin of ignorance, everyone just thinks of the one. We don't think of the other. Well, hopefully we'll talk about that next week. Today I want to talk about the high-handed sin, because it's actually never referenced in Leviticus 1 through 16. And as we'll go through, I'll show you in the scriptures, there was no sacrifice for a high-handed sin. Not even the Day of Atonement took away the sin that was called a high-handed sin. So I'm going to talk about what's not there first, just to so we can juxtapose it, we can contrast it with the other two. Okay, so what is a high-handed sin? So you might want to turn to Numbers 15. We'll look at, I'm going to try to move quickly, but we'll look at the whole chapter actually at some point. So Numbers 15 is also laws about sacrifices. And when we get to the end of the book, or the end of the chapter, we'll see about high-handed sin. So at this point in time, I want to turn to verse 32. No, not verse 32. Whoops. Not yet. I want to go to verse, I wrote down the wrong verse. Maybe 27. Okay, so Numbers 15, verse 27, because I want to get the contrast here. If a person sins unintentionally, okay, I don't like the word unintentionally. If one person sins, he shall offer a female goat a year old for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for the person who made the mistake. And when he sins, to make atonement for him, he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, anyone who sins, for him who is a native among the people of Israel, or for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, that's why we call it a high-handed sin. Okay, Numbers 15, verse 30. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is a native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall utterly be cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. Now, the word cut off, that phrase in the Old Testament, has two meanings. It can be used in two different ways. One is the death penalty, and there are some places where it's equated to the death penalty. The other is to be cut off from the blessing of the Lord, which is to be excommunicated from the promised land, kicked out of the people of promise. So there are two senses in which cut off is mean. But you can see here that anyone who does anything with a high hand, doesn't matter who it is, they shall be cut off from the people. They shall be utterly cut off. Their iniquity is upon them. There is no forgiveness of sin, and there is no sacrifice for sin. So this is why we call it a high-handed sin. So the idea is kind of like raising your hand and swearing an oath that you are going to do what you're about to do, knowing full well that what you're about to do is a sin, and no one's going to stop you. That's the attitude that is behind this person's heart. Okay, so they know full well what they're about to do, and no one's going to say otherwise. Now, I want to make a couple comments here on the Ten Commandments. Some people look at the Ten Commandments and they say, well, there's no punishments given when we look at the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments are given in two places, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And for example, in Exodus 20, I'll just read a couple of the verses here. It says, verse 13, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, and so forth. And so some people will look at that and say, well, because there's no penalty given, these must all be high-handed sins for which there's no forgiveness. However, we have to be a little careful on drawing that conclusion, because there are many other passages that discuss all of these things in some great detail. And some places there are penalties, but it's nuanced, so we have to be very careful with that. We'll look at murder as an example. I thought I'd just pick one as an example. So Numbers 15 has tells us what that high-handed sin is. The Ten Commandments are not necessarily high-handed sins, although, like I said, we'll qualify that here in just a moment. But we'll go back and kind of look at Numbers 15 here in a little bit more detail, just since I made that caveat. Oh, that's why I was confused. Okay. I was on the wrong page of my notes. Yeah, so let's look at Numbers 15 in a little bit more detail. So at the beginning of the chapter, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel. When you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I'm going to give to you, and you offer to the Lord from the herd or from a flock a food offering." Now, if you remember from last week, or no, 2 weeks ago, see who the A students are in the class. We didn't translate that as food offering. What did we translate it as? Those of you who are here. Not a wave offering. Oh, we haven't talked about wave offering yet. No, not bread. Food offering was an offering that was burned on the altar. Okay, so the old King James word was meat, which then the ESV translators updated to food, which is the modern English word for meat in the King James, but it is actually just an offering which is burned. I'm not talking about anyone's cooking, but on the altar. Okay, so it's burned on the altar, or cooked on the altar. So when they say a food offering, it's an offering that is burnt, which is opposed to a burnt offering, which is a special kind of offering. So flock, a food offering or a burnt offering or a sacrifice. And then notice that it says to fulfill a vow, a free will offering, your appointed feasts, to make a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So we have some different offerings that are mentioned there. We have a burnt offering, then we have a vow or a free will offering or an appointed feast. We haven't talked about any of those yet because they weren't in Leviticus 1 through 3. He who brings his offering shall offer to the Lord a grain offering. So whenever you bring any other kind of offering, you must also bring a grain offering with it. So I mentioned that last time, that there's other rules about when to bring offerings. So the grain offering, and it spells out again the recipe. I had to look at you for that. The recipe for the offering. You shall offer, verse 5, you shall offer with the burnt offering, or for a sacrifice in general, also a wine offering and a drink offering, or as a drink offering. So there's also a drink offering for each lamb. So you had to bring the bread, and you had to bring, which was unleavened, as you remember from Leviticus 2, the grape juice. We call it grape juice. You can call it wine. It's the same word in the Old Testament, but it would also not be fermented. It would be unleavened in that sense. So those had to come with it to the Lord. Verse 8, when you offer a bull as a burnt offering to fulfill a vow or a peace offering to the Lord, then you also have to include a grain offering, and it tells you how big that has to be, and a drink offering as well. So there's some additional parts to the sacrifices there here in Numbers. And then down in verse 17, I think, verse 17 then is the first fruits. And I mentioned that last time too, that one of the sacrifices or one of the feast times is first fruits. So whenever you have, you bring your harvest in, you set the first part of your harvest, your grain, aside, and that's used to sacrifice to the Lord. You give that to the Lord. And of course, the priests get a percentage of that to eat. So your vegetables, your fruits, your cattle, when you're lambing, your first lambs go and are offered. So that's the offering of the first fruits. Okay, so that's just a little bit of extra information from last time. Now, verse 22, if you sin, and it says unintentionally, I'm trying to avoid that word without getting into too much detail and just saying I don't like it. So I'm just going to not read it. No, for now. Because it's not, intentionality doesn't have anything to do with it. So I don't blame the translators. It's not an easy Hebrew construction. So if you sin and do not observe all these commandments that the Lord has spoken, all that the Lord has commanded you by Moses, from the day that the Lord gave commandment and onward throughout all your generations, then if it was done without the knowledge of the congregation, so this actually is now getting into a sin of unknowing sin, or sin of ignorance. All the congregation shall offer a bull. So we're getting into a sin of ignorance, or an unknowing sin through that part. And then you have the quote-unquote unintentional sin in verse 27, and then the high-handed sin. So there are three sins here. What I'm trying to do, not so well, is point out that in this passage we have all three sins stated. The one in verse 24 that says, if it was done unintentionally without the knowledge of, okay? So that's a sin of an unknowing sin. Then when he says in verse 27, if a person sins unintentionally, okay, that's actually the intentional sin. And then in verse 30, if a person does anything with a high hand, okay, then there's no sacrifice. So here's our three sins. Now, what I'd like to do is look at murder as an example. Well, first, let's look at some examples. Yes. So what would be an example of a high-handed sin? That's the question that should be going through your mind. What's a concrete example? Well, sometimes in the law, we're given the law, and then we're given a short little story. And often it's the case that the short little story is an illustration of something that we just covered in the law, or is about to cover in the law. Okay? So when you read the law and you're like, why are these little short stories in here? To break up the monotony? They do that, but that's not their sole intention. So it's rather commonly considered, Numbers 15 verses 32 through 36, is an illustration of a high-handed sin. So if we look at this paragraph, because it comes right after it, and we'll look at it and kind of see why. The people of Israel, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. Now, you are not allowed to work on the Sabbath. What was the purpose for gathering sticks? To cook or heat, either one. Okay. When were you supposed to gather your sticks for cooking or heating? Before Saturday. You had 6 days, you had Sunday through Friday, to do your gathering so that you didn't have to gather anything on Saturday. So, it's the Sabbath day, he's out gathering sticks. This is considered work. This is something he should not have been doing. Those who found him gathering sticks, now notice there's more than one person, it's plural. They found him in the act of gathering sticks. So you have more than one witness who can verify the account that this man was gathering sticks on the Sabbath. They found him in the act. They brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody. They arrested him, basically, because it had not been clear what should be done with him. So they didn't know what to do with him. Okay? And the Lord said to Moses, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, there's a whole part of the story that's missing, okay, which is basically the trial. Why? What was the offense that it was so bad that he was stoned to death for it? I mean, picking up sticks doesn't seem to be that bad of an offense. Now, he's working on the Sabbath, so that's one of the 10 Commandments. Keep the Sabbath holy. So it is one of the 10 Commandments he was breaking. But because it comes right after this law of high-handed sin, what we come to understand is, okay, so these people, find this person out picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And they say, hey, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. You should have already done this. And the man says to them, I don't care what the Lord says. I need sticks, and I'm picking up sticks. I'm gathering fuel for the fire. And they said, but it's wrong. You need to stop what you're doing and repent of your sin. And he says, no, I don't care what anybody says. I'm picking up sticks on the Sabbath. I'm gathering fuel for the fire on Saturday, and I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what Moses says. I'm doing this. And they said, well, now you're in trouble. But we don't know what to do with you. Okay. So they bring him in, and the Lord says, well, it's clear. What the heart attitude here to the Lord is clear. And so the death penalty is what is given to him. No sacrifice. There's no sacrifice for sin here. And that's true, what was true of the high-handed sin. There's no offering for sacrifice. So when you ask the question, well, what's an example of a high-handed sin? Then the Lord gives us one in his word right afterwards. Here's a case. It doesn't matter how small it appears that the sin is, but if it's done with that attitude, there is no forgiveness. And it doesn't matter what it is. So, we have that example. Now, what about murder? So I wanted to look at murder because this actually gets us into some finer nuances of the law and this idea of high-handed sin. So in Genesis 9, the first murder, of course, takes place in Genesis 4. Remember that? Cain kills Abel. But then, in Genesis 9, we have stated, I guess I need two hands. Genesis 9, God says to Noah, because in Genesis 6, remember, the world is turned to violence. Violence and sexual abuse is what riddles mankind in Genesis 6. If that doesn't sound familiar. So after the flood, God says to Noah that they can start eating animals now. They're all vegetarians up until this point in time. And he says in verse 4, you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. This is what he says in verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So murder is always wrong. Doesn't matter when you live, where you live. If you live on Mars, murder is always wrong. So he says, and the reason for that is man is made in God's own image. Now in Exodus 20, we read that murder was one of the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus 21, we're given a little nuance to this idea of murder. So Exodus 21, verse 23, we see in this verse the repeated, it's repeating from Genesis 9. If there is harm, you shall pay life for life. So, and this is the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So the idea for this is on restitution. There's always a max penalty or maximum that you can request for restitution if harm is done. But if someone kills someone, it's the same principle, life for life. The murderer is to be put to death. Now he says, back in verse 22 gives us the context. When men, whoops, that's too far back. Oh, sorry, I want not 22. That's the pregnant woman. Verse 12. So 21 verse 12, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. Okay, so if you punch someone and he dies, then you're a murderer. But notice in verse 13, if he, the striker, did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. Okay, so now there's this other case. So if you go up and you attack someone, basically, and you kill him, all right, then you get the death penalty. But if you didn't lie in wait, so the first scenario we call in our modern parlance first-degree murder. Okay, that you planned it ahead of time. You thought about it. It was something that you were doing maliciously. Okay, so that's premeditated. We call that first-degree murder. The second one, if you didn't lie in wait, but God let him fall into your hands. In other words, someone attacked you and you started fighting, and in the fight, the other person dies. Okay, you had no intention of killing them, but they do. They fall, hit their head, whatever, they die. Then you have a way out. We'll look at these cities of refuge a little bit later in Numbers 35. Then you have a way out. But then notice he says, if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from the altar that he may die. So again, in verse 14, willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning. He's not allowed to make a sacrifice. There's no sacrifice. That's what that phrase means, that you'll take him from my altar. If that person brings a sin offering, you don't accept it. Okay, that person is going to die. So we have this kind of first degree, second degree murder type language here, which, by the way, and I mentioned this before somewhere, the state of Minnesota, most of our laws around murder, you can actually trace back to the Old Testament. Third degree drug charges, not, but most of the other ones you can. All right, so